Live, and we are sponsored by I can't even say AIM, which is AIM Meetings and Events, home of the no-cost COVID testing program. Happy to have them as our sponsor. And again, we are on a roll for this continued all-day live broadcast for GMID 21. And I'm really excited about our next guest. She is the principal at Blalock Consulting, where she serves as a consultant for associations and DMOs in the areas of ex-gen governance, revenue generation strategies, and EDI strategic management. Tamela Blalock. And Tamela will share with us today about truth and accountability, along with the critical importance on local government, networking, and relationship building. And that is coming up right here next on Hospitality Today Live. Welcome back, everyone. I am here today with Tamela Blalock with Blalock Consulting, and I am just thrilled as can be that she is here with us today on this celebratory day, which happens to be GMID. Well, welcome, Tamela.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Deborah. I appreciate being here.
Oh, it's a delight. It's a complete delight because I'm thrilled about having you because this is a topic that just does not come up very often in the hospitality industry. And I believe that it needs to be in the forefront, above and beyond most things, because it affects and it impacts the hospitality industry. So I'd like for us to talk about it. And I know you're going to talk about it on both sides, individually, which is, on the personal side, and the organizational, the culture side. So let's talk about this immediately. I know it could probably be an all-day conversation and we only have a short period of time, but why do you believe that an organization should have truth and accountability?
Very important question. And the short answer is it started with my doing like DEI consulting, in that, and you realize that DEI consulting starts in the middle. Starts in the middle of the process. So you get a lot of operations, you get a lot of activations, but you don't get a culture change. And then being a governance nerd, it's just like, well, what do you need for culture change? And that gets to truth and accountability. I think the terminology people may be more familiar is truth and reconciliation, specifically that relates to South Africa, which is the first country to really have a major truth and reconciliation, or they would have been in a horrible civil war. Not saying that everything is gravy in South Africa. It allowed for a state where they're able to address, the atrocities, the systemic, multi-generational, multi-centennial, atrocities that have happened in that country. What allowed for there to be truth, accountability, reconciliation, which is a type of healing, so that they can attempt to move and advance. So it looks at the culture instead of only the operations.
Wow. So you knowing this and believing that every organization and an individual should have truth and accountability, what is it that they need to understand? Because it's really not an option.
It's not an option. And also just the terminology, it sounds very daunting, like truth and accountability.
Yeah.
It's like it sounds expensive, sounds time consuming, and it sounds like it's just like a lot of work. It's like a whole
like what would have it does.
What would have to do. And anything worth doing does require an investment. And also it's more digestible than it would initially appear. So I liken it to like a couple things put together. So it's like, what's truth and accountability in a nutshell? It's looking at it from a North America standpoint, United States of America in particular. It's a combination of the 1619 Project,
Okay.
marriage or family counseling, if you've done that, particularly the Imago version, and then the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It's just a combination of those three things.
Okay.
Activate it, and then there you go. You have everything you need to begin truth and accountability.
Wow. Okay. So can you break these down with all three of those when it comes to personal truth and accountability, and then break it down for organization or company truth and accountability? And is there a difference? Is there a similarity? But separating and explaining those two might help clarify truth and accountability.
So start for ourselves as individuals. And I would say it's easier to do that if you align yourself as an individual to what you're doing professionally right now. So I would take myself, in addition to having a consulting, I'm also a vice president at a trade association. So we're look at the 1619 Project, look at the history of the United States and how the United States, came into being, so very long, very nuanced, very complicated story short. We have our indigenous, our First Nation people here in the United States. We have colonization doing a lot of horrible things. Then those who stayed in the United States after colonization, let's call it, moved the indigenous people out of power and out of agency, and then imported against their will people from African nations, and then also had immigration from a lot of countries, both from Asia and Europe, in addition to South and Central America. And then there's a lot of conquest, war, horrible things. And starting the country, they started with looking at their governance documents. What are your bylaws? The United States bylaws is the Constitution. And there, looking at any organization, particularly in that part of it, you look at the governance documents, creating the culture. They created an in-group and an out-group. So when you look at the Constitution, we look at all the laws in the United States, who is in the in-group, and then who is in the out-group. So the in-group are those who are prioritized to receive full benefits and rights, and the out-group gets a fraction of those or none of those at all. Over time, the in-group does expand, as does the out-group. And then taking all of that to myself and my role in the present day, that's where we engage the Marvel Cinematic Universe. So the in-group and out-group that was created from the governance documents, Constitution, Bill of Rights, all of the laws in our federal statutes and the state statutes and the state constitutions and all of that, as people are enfranchised, getting access to the in-group, when do you become fully vested in the in-group, or are you in the out-group? And then looking at myself, what I'm doing now personally, I've military child, so within the military culture, I'm part of it in-group. I look at the fact that I was privileged to get scholarships to like really key boarding schools and Georgetown University. So in certain socioeconomic areas, I am within that in-group. I'm in the association industry, and I'm in senior leadership team. So in that space, I'm in that in-group. But looking at all the places where I'm in the in-group, who's on the out-group? And am I in myself looking at the culture, the organizations that I'm in, places of privilege and power that I have, and am I actively expanding the in-group, or am I maintaining the status quo, which is allowing myself to have a place in the in-groups and allowing the out-groups to continue to exist? And that's where we get to the Marvel Cinematic Universe, because looking at truth and accountability, there's a binary. Either you are a sidekick for the villains, so Hydra, I'm a Marvel fan, or you're a sidekick for Shield, where you're activating, trying to create equality for the out group, where essentially there's no longer an out group, there's just a very, very large in group, and that's the norm. And if you are doing nothing, so if you're going with the status quo, you're still a sidekick for Hydra, for the villains. So it's looking at what you're doing, and are you looking to continue to expand the in group and shrink the out group to where there's only one group, or you're maintaining the status quo? And I know for a while I had been very focused on myself, my own personal journey. So I was definitely sidekick for the villains because I was very internally focused. It's when I looked at what I can do to expand opportunities, expand access, equal access for others. So it became a norm of that culture and not necessarily requiring on the actions of one person. Did I realize that I am being a sidekick for SHIELD and not continue to be a sidekick for Hydra. So that's an example of truth and accountability, looking at one's personal journey.
Wow, that is amazing. And I can, now that you simplified that and using the example, I'm a Marine brat. So when you said that, I'm like, oh, okay, I get that. I'm in that in group. So really the out group is considered the villain and then the in group is considered Marvel. Is that what I'm understanding?
Well, it's looking at the whatever culture, because culture is more important than, strategic plan or operations.
Okay.
So we have DEI or strategic plan. I get that. What's your culture though? So we're like, how are you created? Because whatever is the norm of your culture, whatever's in, like, looking at the government, the United States government, whatever's in the Constitution, there are people who have rights and people who don't.
Right.
So and so that culture that comes out of your governance documents, is your norm. So your culture will favor the in-group because your governance documents have designated these are the in-group. So therefore there's an out-group, and this is how we operate. So not necessarily intentionally treating the out-group differently, but by default you are, if they don't have the same rights and privileges as the in-group. So it's understanding that the in-group, out-group exist independently of whether we want it to or not. Like, it's a reality and it's here. What are we doing to shrink the out-group and just eradicate the out-group so that there's only one large in-group?
Okay. That really helps clarify, and you do such a great job of that. So that's a better understanding of where truth and accountability actually comes from. And Lisa, totally, as a matter of fact, you got some fans here. Lisa loves the Marvel idea there, verse. That does make a lot of sense. And of course, David Kleiman, who is on the broadcast right now. He's believing that this is a very important dialogue. And it really, truly, truly is, because it almost sounds like it should be the core of any organization or culture to understand this in order to, set up their employees or their culture and knowing how to strategize around that truth and accountability. So I'm digging this. This is great information. And again, the way you explain it is just so very clear. And so knowing that this is a focal point that they need to understand, are you finding, working with other companies and organizations, they're getting it right away, or is it take some time to sell this idea?
I would say, honestly, I arrived to this point where I stopped taking, more clients for DEI work, because I realized without doing truth and accountability, the DEI work is independent of your intention. It's just performative. It's just like, it's a lot of nice bells and whistles and it's a nice face on it, but it's not a culture change. For example, I will give all of these bills, to change voter access, in the United States. And I juxtapose that with almost the same time last year with the protests after that started, after the murder of George Floyd. And it's like, all these corporations, like, they had statements and videos and we are going to make changes and we are invested for every single community and we are here and, all of that. And like, now, when is your pedal to the metal, and also for all of these states, especially for all these organizations in the state where you are headquartered. Okay. You hire people who used to work in the White House. You hire people who used to work in the Senate and in the House, as your lobbyist, to know every single bill that's gone into that state house. So you are not surprised. You didn't even not realize like these bills are being passed in your state, but you aren't motivated to action. So you see, like, you haven't changed your culture. Last summer, you did some actions, so you have some activations, but your commitment is not felt inside. No, not yet, because you would have been much more proactive before activists, force your hand to become proactive. So that's the difference between, DEI activation and actually getting into truth and accountability, and changing your culture.
Okay. Okay. So what about the culture in the hospitality industry? Is there anything new or different, or do you see things that within that culture that needs to be more truth and accountability?
Definitely. I have to say there are a few DMOs. Portland is the first one that comes to mind, that I definitely see like doing the work and getting into their history. And because they're doing the work, and like I won't get into the parts of the state of Oregon's history that aren't awesome. If you're curious, you should look it up. They are fascinating. And it's also Portland leaning into it and being truthful about it and being holistic, and working to do that, because it's a huge cultural change. And it also is, I am very proud of them, for being very active of it, because it takes a lot of courage to admit what your state did and by default what your cities did and have allowed, and what you're doing actively to change and evolve that culture. So I would say like Portland is the first example I can think of where, there is not only looking at moving forward. I would say a lot of DEI is just like, wow, world is in a crazy state. We have no idea how this happened. Let's move forward. Where truth and accountability is like, how do we get here? It's being intellectually curious about like, how do we have a present state that is so crazy, and in doing that. And you are activating truth accountability in a genuine way when you realize nothing is broken. None of our inequalities result of something that's broken. These are intentional actions. Like this is the result that was intended, given how things are instructed. You don't work so hard to create an in-group to make sure that that in-group doesn't benefit in a way that the out-group doesn't, or that the out-group has a very different experience from the in-group. So it's looking at that and looking at how your organization may have been, or the leaders of your organization, depending on how old your organization is, have been maybe actual lead villains, the strategist villains, or has your organization been a sidekick villain in this process and just not really done much to change the status quo? It is what it is. We're just going to keep going with it, and doing that.
Wow, that is great. Well, I always want to be on the Marvel side, and with my company, that's for sure. Now, as far as the individual side, how can an individual find their truth and accountability?
I'd say it's easier to do it, since a lot of us here are professionals, with how you've behaved professionally. In professional world. Like we brought up David Kleiman, for example. David Kleiman is someone, who looks, who sees the status quo, and if he doesn't like it, he works to change it.
Right.
Make introductions, sponsor people, to be in different places, to amplify a voice, but he looks to make change in leadership. He looks to make changes, in spaces where people are on boards or advisory boards, who have speaking positions. He's looking to change the structure of whose voices are heard, whose voices are prioritized, so that there can be cultural change. Like that is consistent action that he is doing, with the full understanding that he can do this work because he's in the positions where he can easily do that work, but also understanding that we don't have such in-group, out-group dynamics by accident. These are intentional actions, and he wants to eliminate the out-group and expand the in-group.
Right. So one of the elements is not only accepting truth and accountability and being aware of it, but also what is the action plan behind it? Do you need to make changes? Do you need to make some tweaks? Do you need to make some additions, or what that strategy toward action, instead of just, okay, we've got our truth and accountability, let's move on with our day. You actually have to put it into action, and utilizing David Kleiman as an example is all about truth and accountability.
Yes. Now I would say how to do it. If you're with me so far, you're still.
It's a lot.
It's
a lot.
In the Marvel truth and accountability, universe. Like I found an industry that is less likely to take this personally, to use them.
Is that right?
As an example, in this.
Okay.
So I, even though a dear sister of mine works in this industry, they are necessarily on the whole industry, and that's the railroad industry. So if the railroad industry were to do a truth and accountability, I mean, from the very beginning, the railroad industry was about a very small in group and having a very huge out group, and also just treating this out group horribly. So you look at the construction of the railroad. Well, first we need the land. How do we get the land? First Nations people, they got to go. All right, so we're just going to move them. We don't care where. We don't care if we move them away from the richest and wealthiest resources, from resources that have fruits and vegetables and a lot of protein, and move them to places which is very arid. So then they are dependent upon government subsidized food, which then adjusts their body chemistry. And that's why so many of the illnesses of our First Nations people are different, because they were taken away from their environments and put into environments where you essentially need processed food. Right. But that's what you can store, and have that. So First Nations people took their land, not a good thing, right? Then, I mean, we have to build it, right? So who's going to build it? Well, look, who can we not pay or pay very little? And Chinese immigrants. Let's do that, right? So Chinese immigrants, long history of building a railroad. Also, currently enslaved or recently former enslaved people, Mexican immigrants, etc. So it's just like, let's take our people of color, put them in horrible conditions. It was very violent working conditions to build the railroads, with just really intense goals and mandates that, to build that. So the construction of it is terrible. Yeah. What and how were we transporting in the early days of the railroad? Yeah, early days of human trafficking. Where did that happen? Railroad. So you have that happening. And who could travel? So even if you have the means and you're a person of color, the ticket wouldn't even be honored. And if it was honored, then you're sitting down there with the coal, shoving in there, no matter how elegantly you're not treated as a full human being. You're just very much in that out group. And maintain who can work on the railroad, and if they can, what positions were they given, and how are they paid? Oh, interesting. Yeah, so it's like, as you keep going, you just look into the railroad, and it's just like atrocity after atrocity, but it's a status quo. Right. For that. So it's there's so much truth to be shared about the railroad industry, and so much accountability that must be taken. And not necessarily one person stand up and take accountability for it. I'm not asking we're flogging people in the streets. It's more saying like, this happened, and this happened intentionally, from this industry. And it created a culture where, thinking of a woman as an engineer or, any person of color is mind blowing, because that is not who railroad industry allowed in that in group in those positions. When I just imagine for that to happen, not that these people can be qualified. It's just like, they are not in our in group. And that's a culture that has been perpetuated, in the railroad industry for a long period of time. Wow. Well, okay. So knowing that about other industries like the railroad industry, from a scale from 1 to 10, 10 being the best, 1 being the worst, where is the hospitality industry when it comes to truth and accountability? I would say any industry in the United States that goes through a truth and accountability process, what you will find will be very upsetting, right? It's spoiler alert, very small in groups were maintained. Is that right? Yeah, so the number is very low. Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So what you're going to find like in that process will not fill you with hope nor inspire you. However, it's a true story that needs to be told. It's like in order for us to understand where we are, where we have all, been, where we're all accountable or complacent for maintaining it, that's where our part in that industry, no matter where it is, we have been sidekicks for villains, and accepting that us coming in, particularly as we came into leadership, we've just perpetuated, what has been established and what has been maintained. And for some organization I'm with now is 105 years old. So it's
Right.
like there's a lot of norms in our culture, that we've allowed to maintain. So it's acknowledging that, looking for what in our governance. I always say start with your governance documents. Tell the story, tell the truth, tell it to everyone. And then what are you going to do to actively adjust your culture? It's not a flip of a switch. It's like marriage counseling. It takes a lot of time to have that. You have to admit where you, even if you did it unintentionally, you still create an environment that harms someone else.
Okay. And so on this day, GMID Day in the hospitality industry, how is GMID important, especially to the government sector of the hospitality industry?
Oh yeah, well, I would say in the United States, it's actually the local governments, where we're seeing truth and accountability.
All right.
I would say the stories you heard are reparations. So there's like a town in North Carolina and also one in Illinois, Indiana. My apologies for not knowing it offhand, where they are doing reparations for specific atrocities, that happened. And that is true. That's a story that people know about but hasn't been told. I would say a lot of people, an example of that is knowing about the Tulsa massacre and race riots. That happened. So it's acknowledging your history, but your entire history.
Okay.
What happened to the out group? How was that promulgated in the out group? And what are we going to do to acknowledge? What are our steps in healing in that space? And it's not a one, as you learn more, you acknowledge it and you do more.
Sure.
Than that for organization. So you can start small with who was allowed to be leaders, who's allowed to serve on your board, who did we support, who do we have, who did we just, our organization just imagine can be leaders in our organization, and who have we just not nourished and supported, recruited to be leaders, in that. And but doing it with the understanding that it was intentional actions that got us here, and it's going to be intentional actions that get us out. Whether or not we're aware of it, we're sidekicks for villains, but now that we're going to be sidekicks for S.H.I.E.L.D., we're going to be sidekicks for the heroes. We have to acknowledge that shift. And in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, there's a lot of people started out on the villain side.
Sure.
They came to the hero side, particularly X-Men. So that's the journey. Because we all have nuance.
Exactly.
As people, we're not binary, but our impact in terms of truth accountability is non-binary.
And truth and accountability does impact you and your organization. That's why it's just a very important topic and process. And working with you, the expert in that area, just is icing on the cake. So, gosh, that was a wealth of information. I did not know that. I'm just wowed by it, and I know a lot of our viewers are too. And I would imagine it'd be okay to have them contact you. I can put that information up there for your email and your website. Is there any other way that they can contact you as well?
Those would be the best ways to do it.
Okay, great.
I would say to start through email and to have a conversation, see where we are. Just to talk about it. You don't necessarily have to hire me. Just to talk through it. I am here for anyone who wants to get involved in the truth and accountability journey.
How can they not? I tell you, it's really important to for any, again, organization and to helping individuals understand truth and accountability. Now, you've proven that to me, and I'm sure you proved that to all our viewers today, especially in the hospitality industry. And I can't thank you enough for sharing that information with us here, especially on the special GMID edition. So thank you, Tamela. It was a pleasure meeting you and having you on board here. And please be safe and healthy. And I'm sure we'll see you at an in-person event real soon.
I look forward to it. And it's lovely to meet you. And thank you for making time for me today, Deborah. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, there you have it. Tamela, who just joined us, just an incredible, brilliant woman that knows her information pertaining to truth and accountability. And now I have a better understanding of what it is, what it can do for you, not only on an individual basis, but for your company and organization as well. So I want to really thank her for joining us today. And if you'd like to see the replay or like to share the episode, by all means, just go to our Facebook page or our YouTube channel, Hospitality Today Live. And I want to thank our sponsor, AIM Meetings and Events, the home of the no-cost COVID testing program, for sponsoring today's episode as well. So let's keep moving and celebrating throughout this entire day. Who do we have up next? Well, it turns out it's a friend of Tamela's and mine as well. And because he is so brilliant, always knows what's going on in the industry, and very proud to say a very good dear friend, again, of Tamela's and mine. We're talking about CMM David Kleiman. David is the president of the Kleiman Group, and he's going to explain what the true definition of volunteerism is today and why we need to do more in order to help our industry and including ourselves. So don't go too far. Take a quick break and we will be right back here on Hospitality Today Live.